Iowa is the first state to have the opportunity to weigh in on presidential primary contests, making the Iowa Caucus an invaluable contest for candidates vying for their party's nomination. For the 2020 election, the Democratic Party will officially begin choosing their party leader in public precinct meetings all across the state on Monday, February 3rd. Iowa's delegates represent just 1% of the national total, but the outcomes in Iowa greatly influence future contests. More often than not, the top choice in Iowa goes on to become the party's presidential nominee. Few doubt the indelible influence of Iowans when it comes to selecting presidential candidates, but even fewer seem to really understand the process. In this video, I'll answer this burning question about the Iowa Caucus. How does it work? The Iowa Caucus is the first contest for the Democratic primary, which will determine the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, who will in turn run against the Republican candidate, almost certainly President Donald Trump, in the 2020 election. The primary contest culminates at the Democratic National Convention, which for 2020 will be held in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in mid-July. At the convention, the presidential nominee is chosen based on votes made by delegates. Delegates, much like electors in the Electoral College process, are actual human beings who actually vote on behalf of their communities. There are two kinds of delegates. There are unpledged delegates, also known as superdelegates, who are granted a vote because of their status within the party. These are generally elected career politicians and members of the Democratic National Committee. In Iowa, 8 of the 49 delegates are unpledged. For the 2020 election, the superdelegates will not vote until the second ballot, meaning if a majority of the other type of delegates coalesce behind one candidate, that candidate will secure the nomination. These delegates are called pledged delegates, so named because they are pledged to vote for a particular candidate, when determined by the outcome of their state's contest. Iowa will send 41 pledged delegates to the National Convention in 2020. In the first ballot, they must vote for their designated candidate, but if the convention goes to a second ballot, they can change their vote. Most states select their delegates with a primary contest, which is a statewide secret ballot vote, not unlike the process of voting in general elections. But in Iowa, there's a caucus, and their more complicated process is historically why Iowa gets to go first. The more complex and active process also means voter turnout is relatively low. Generally speaking, only the more politically active and passionate voters tend to show up. On the evening of February 3rd, Iowans will gather in 1,678 precinct locations across the state, as well as 96 satellite locations across the state, country, and globe. At 7 p.m., their doors will shut and the process will begin. Voters will split up into different sections of the room to designate their top choice of presidential candidate. There may also be a gathering of undecided voters. Everyone gets counted, and caucus organizers take note of the groups that are not viable. In other words, too small to win delegates. Generally speaking, a candidate needs 15% of voters in a room to be viable. At some caucuses, however, the threshold is much higher than 15%. In caucuses that elect just one county delegate, the first count is sufficient. After the alignment, the caucus as a whole elects their delegate by a majority vote. In caucuses electing 2 delegates, the group must have at least 25% to be considered eligible. Those electing 3 have a threshold of 16 2/3%. In caucuses that elect 4 or more, the threshold is 15%. If a candidate does not meet the threshold, their supporters can realign to support another candidate, or they can attempt to persuade other voters from non-viable groups to join theirs. They have just 15 minutes to realign. Unlike in previous contests, for 2020, voters who select a viable candidate with their initial preference are not allowed to realign. They will in fact be given presidential preference cards to write their choices down. If they get tired of the process, they can hand in their cards, leave early, and still be counted in subsequent votes. But since convincing the supporters of non-viable candidates to switch over can have an astounding impact on the nomination of a presidential candidate, dedicated supporters are likely to stick around. Another count is taken. Every candidate who clears the viability threshold is awarded at least one county delegate, with more awarded proportionally to candidates with more votes. The state party then calculates and reports the number of state delegate equivalents each candidate has won based on precinct caucus results. Once all precincts have reported in, the National Convention delegate count can be calculated and reported. These are the crucial numbers. They tell us how many delegates from Iowa will support each candidate at the DNC. In other words, who won and by how much. Technically speaking, this is only the beginning of the process. 11,402 county convention delegates will go on to their county convention in March. There, 2,107 district and state delegates are selected. District delegates will head to the district conventions on April 25th, and it isn't until the state convention in June that the 49 delegates who will go on to the Democratic National Convention in Milwaukee are finished being selected. Of course, few bother to follow these later conventions, as the important results are already determined in February by the precinct caucuses. And just 1 week after Iowa, most everyone will focus in on the next most important early state, New Hampshire. New Hampshire, of course, has a primary election, a far simpler, straightforward system. In fact, while caucuses were once the most common system for choosing nominees, most states have opted to switch over to a primary. Still, in Iowa, the old ways prevail, and the ruckus, inaccessible, and frankly bizarre system remains in place. A primary may be easier, but Iowans manage to recurrently live the answer to this question about their president picking process. How does it work?